Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on Chapter 8, Secondary Data. So, up until this point in the class, we've been talking about research studies with you as the primary researcher. So, you are the person on the ground collecting the data. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about the alternative to that, which is what we call secondary data, which is where you are using data that's collected by someone else and what that looks like and how we sort of operate within the realm of secondary data. And that's going to be our primary focus for this chapter. So, to start, as I've already briefly mentioned, secondary data is the data or raw information that we can use that's collected by other researchers. So, this stands in contrast to what we've been talking about, which we can refer to as primary data. So, historically in this class, we've been talking about primary data, which is the data that's collected by us. And then secondary data is the data that is collected by somebody else that we then use. And secondary data is really helpful because it provides quite a few benefits to us as researchers. Namely, secondary data is quite a bit available. Like there's a lot of data, there are multiple researchers doing studies at once and collecting data. So there are a lot more options for us to be able to access secondary data, which is one of the benefits of using secondary data. But also, researchers may be interested in data or information that has become impossible to collect. So, a good example of this is if you're asking about really sensitive information, it might be impossible for you as a researcher individually to collect this data, but maybe a group of researchers or even a government agency can collect that data a little bit easier. So, it's more available to you if you go through these secondary data analyses options. But also, accessing secondary data allows us as researchers to have information that would have never been directly available to us. So, good example of this is things like average income or how many people are living in someone's home in an entire area. Like I'm thinking of census data. That's a really good example of secondary data. As a researcher, you can collect all of that information from participants, but why would you if you don't have to? If you can gather all of that information from a secondary source that's already been collected for you. So, secondary data is really helpful in gathering that information that might not be directly available to us as researchers. Also, when we're talking about secondary data analysis and secondary data studies, the availability of design and sampling information can be a huge benefit to you as a researcher. So, as an example of this, when you are using data from a previous study, so study that has been conducted by someone else, a secondary data source, that source gives you as a researcher information on all of the details of how that study was conducted, how it was designed, and what type of data was used in that study. This frees us as researchers from having to make such decisions on our own. If we are using data from someone else's study, we don't have to determine how the study is conducted, what the specific procedures are, how we want to collect the data, who the participants are, what type of sampling method we want to do. If we're using secondary data, we are free from making those decisions. But as a researcher, it's still important for us to become familiar with this information. We want to know what research design, what sampling method, and what data collection processes they used, because that design information is going to be related to the analyses that we run on our studies. So even though we aren't directly involved in the decision making with those design and sampling sort of ideas, we still want to know that information. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there, but in overall, we still consider this to be quite a big benefit of secondary data analysis. But also, secondary data offers a lot of opportunities for replication. So, replication of a study can happen in two different ways. The first of those is that you can collect primary data, that are exactly like the original study that you were trying to replicate. So one research team does their own study, and then you try to directly copy the original design of that study in your own study. But the way that you do it different is that you use a different population or a different location to see whether the findings hold true. So that's one of the ways that you can use replication in secondary data. The second way that you can do replication is by using secondary data, by collecting additional information that may be missing from the original study. So say you're doing a study that is looking at cannabis use rates amongst Colorado adolescents. So looking at Colorado high school age students, you're looking at cannabis use. And you might see that this secondary data didn't capture everything that you were looking for. Maybe they're looking at route of administration, maybe they're looking at frequency, and maybe they're even looking at where people are purchasing their cannabis. But this study doesn't ask the age at first cannabis use, and that's information that you want to know. So you might replicate the study by gathering more information that was missing from that first study. And you can do, in order to do this, or by doing this, you can draw on the original study to learn about additional information from the same population, or you can have the data be collected from the same participants or from the same type of population. So if you don't have access to the exact same participants, you get participants in the same area or of the same age that share some characteristics, and then look at them and see, okay, can I gather that information that was missing? And you get those opportunities for replication much more in secondary data because you're able to almost build these studies on top of each other, which provides this amazing benefit to secondary data studies. Also, secondary data is incredibly time effective. When you are collecting primary data, it requires a great deal of your time as a researcher, especially if you're wanting to do a larger study. And analyzing already collected data, so secondary data, is much easier. And the researcher is able to move directly to cleaning data, coding it, and analyzing the data when you use secondary data analysis. So when we say that, you're able to move directly into that coding, cleaning, and analyzing, because oftentimes secondary data is already clean, meaning that the researchers who did their study already moved the missing values or corrected other issues that researchers must resolve when working with primary data. So systematic errors or just like general technical errors, primary researchers typically figure that out, and by the time they send out their data sets to other people to use for secondary data, that stuff has already been worked out. So as a researcher, it is time effective for you to use secondary data analysis in that regard. And relatedly, secondary data is incredibly cost effective. Primary data collection requires you as a researcher to have a pretty large budget that might not always be available to you. So I do a lot of research in suicide, and it's really hard to get large sample sizes because it's a pretty rare outcome when you look at the general scheme of the age range that I'm looking at, because I look at young adolescents. And if I want a sample, a research sample that is in the hundreds, I really have to have access to over 100,000 people participating in my study to only get the couple hundred that I need to actually work with. And that's not always feasible, nor is that cost effective. Like, we can't necessarily afford that at CSU in the work that we do. So we use a lot of secondary data analysis or secondary data sets to gather that information and to get that information from other sources without much of a cost to us as researchers. And also, secondary data analysis allows for us as researchers to use larger amounts of data that would not have been otherwise possible, similar to what I was just talking about with you. Larger data sets allow us as researchers to analyze huge amounts of data, which can make it easier for us to generalize our findings to the general population. So secondary data leads us to having these larger data sets, which can increase the validity and the generalizability of our findings. And there's one particular type of sort of tools that we use to get these large data sets, and it's called data scraping. And data scraping is the process of extracting large amounts of information from social media, business sites, or other websites of interest into a readable spreadsheet. So there are specific websites that are dedicated to data scraping where you just go in there and you see what access to data they have that they've already scraped from websites. So there's actually a really infamous example of data scraping that was done with the Ashley Madison cheating website. That was data scraping. It was a data scraper that went in and gathered all of that information and then dispersed it out. So we could still run data on that data set even though there are many problems with it. But that's the idea, and part of why in secondary data you get these large data sets because you have access to things like data scraping for these public resources. So there are a few major sources of secondary data that I think are important for you to know because although there is an abundant amount of secondary data that's available, it is important to carefully examine the secondary sources by looking at their methodologies. So as a researcher, if you're using secondary data, you still need to have a critical eye on how that data was collected and really why it was collected, because that is going to inform the type of work and the analyses that you run with that data. So as a researcher, we still need to be really careful in examining the sources of our secondary data. And also as researchers, we need information on data availability, such as the possibility of using the data for our own analyses or whether there are applicable terms and conditions. So simply just having data that is open source is one thing, but being able to actually run your own analyses and publish on data is a whole nother thing that as a researcher who's conducting secondary data, you need to know about. So a good example of this is that if you want access to a large data set, you might have to sign an agreement that says that you can run analyses out of this data set, that you can publish information out of this data set. And if you do publish, whether or not the original primary sources get any sort of authorship on your publication because you're using their data set. You have to assess and ascertain that information if you are wanting to do secondary data. So one of the primary areas or primary sources of secondary data is government statistics. So all governments collect various forms of information about their citizens, and these large databases are available to researchers in raw form and include a lot of basic information. And when I say that all governments collect this information, I truly mean all governments collect this information. What type of information they collect and the specific questions might change from one government to the next, but even outside of sort of like the westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries, we still get this government data that is collected. And in the United States, the common one that we have is the Census Bureau, the census that is gathered by our government. And these large data sets are available to us. Like we can get access to them even if it's the actual raw data set or if it's just seeing the outcomes of it. And these government statistics are some of the most comprehensive and oldest data available for most populations. It's actually one of the first sources of secondary data that is known to us because it has been used for so long. And data sets that are available from government agencies include things like, as I already mentioned, the Census Bureau, but also if we look at the United States specifically, we also have access to things like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Archives, and even the Department of Education. All of these are government statistics that we can get information from and data from to run analyses. Another source of information for secondary data is research university data. So, research universities often create institutes that are dedicated to data collection in a specific field that make valuable longitudinal data available to other researchers. So, you might have a research institute or a research group at a university that is dedicated to collecting data on a very specific topic over time. And you do this at a university because there are always students who will pick up and who will be new students at that university who can join the project and continue it moving forward. And one of the largest resources of data sets that are available to students in their inter-universe is the Inter-University Consortium of Political and Social Research, or the ICPSR, which is hosted by the University of Michigan and is a collaboration of 776 institutions that are mostly academic but also government agencies and others. That's all about collecting political and social research data sets that can then be distributed and used by other researchers for additional analyses. Another such resource is the General Social Survey, or the GSS, which has been collecting data since 1972 and has different branches, or quote unquote sister branches, internationally. But another option is that data collected by a specific researcher at a research university is another source of secondary data. So many researchers oftentimes want other researchers to analyze their data and are eager to provide all of the information needed if they're asked. But this remains their choice. So, as a researcher, you might have this data set that you've been collecting for 2 or 3 years and you're really excited about it, and you actually want other people to run their own analyses out of it, but you don't know who is interested. So you just kind of sit back and wait. And if someone reaches out, you're like, yes, please do this, have this. I'd love to see your findings. I'd love to see if you find something similar to me or different so that we can further the understanding in this area. But as a researcher, it's our choice. Like, we can always say, no, I don't want you to run additional analyses out of my study. But yes, maybe I do. It's sort of our choice. But that's another way that we get research university secondary data. Another major and related source of secondary data is institutional data. And institutional data refers to any large organization, such as a school, hospital, a large business, or anything along those lines, that collects information about their clients and employees. And their data, the data that's collected at an institutional level, are often in raw form and not collected for research purposes, but they are still a potential source of data for researchers. So, oftentimes, institutions will collect basic information about their customers, their clients, their employees, whatever the term is used for that institution, but they're not gathering it to run analyses like we might do as researchers. They might just be collecting that information to have it. And as researchers, we might be able to use that information in a meaningful way and to be able to draw analyses from it. And we also have online sources that are great resources for secondary data. For example, social media hubs have demographic data and data pertaining to specific issues that can lead to a lot of information about research that we're interested in. And some of these examples include things like online reviews of products, procedures, events, etc., that can provide us information that might be of interest to us. Like, if we're wanting to look at views on a particular event or a particular product or a particular procedure, we might look at product reviews and see what people are saying and then run analyses from that. That's another example of secondary data. So we've talked about a lot of the advantages of secondary data and the major sources of where we can find that information, but secondary data isn't perfect. We really can't give credence to secondary data without acknowledging that there are disadvantages to secondary data. And one of those disadvantages is what we call the uncertainty of constructs. And I talk about this in the context of secondary data because new studies and findings that are brought about through research improve our previous construct measurements and our knowledge of theories. We get that information through data, through analyses, through research. So, using secondary data can limit a study to the results of an older or possibly outdated collection method. If you are looking at a major data set, you're probably limited in when that data was collected and how the constructs were measured in that data set, but you're still using it because you need the size of that data set, which can lead to some of this uncertainty of constructs because you might be collecting data from a much older sample than what you are hoping for. But also, the original study that you are conducting secondary data out of may have had a different focus than what you're interested in. So some constructs may have been more important to the original researchers than what is of interest to you as the secondary researcher, which can again lead to some uncertainty of how constructs are measured. And as researchers, we must consider whether the original construct of a study fits the focus of our current study. Uncertainty about the measurement of the original construct can cause flaws in our new study or our new secondary data studies results. So we really have to be critical and be looking for that information if we are wanting to conduct secondary data. Another drawback or disadvantage of secondary data is the ambiguity of measurement error. So, when a researcher is highly involved in the process of data collection, they are aware of every aspect of the process, which is crucial to data analysis. If you're conducting primary data collection, you know the ins and outs of your data set. You know who your participants were, what the testing conditions were like, what errors occurred, all that sort of stuff. You know that, and that then informs your analysis process. But in using secondary data, the researcher often takes the information at face validity because there is a lack of good sense of measurement error. We weren't there when the data were collected. We weren't the ones on the ground doing the conversations with the participants. So we don't always have information on measurement error, and we have to take data at face value, which means that we might not know what the measurement error is in our study. And finally, the last disadvantage that I want to present to you is the passage of time, which is sort of what we've already talked about. But when a researcher is highly involved in the process of data collection, they are the ones who know exactly when that data was collected. But secondary data doesn't work that way. Oftentimes, secondary data is collected multiple times and over multiple stints. So you may be using outdated information, and some information may be relevant longer. Like if you're looking at information on cannabis use, maybe it's okay that you're using an older data set because things haven't necessarily changed quite dramatically in our society in terms of legislation around cannabis. But maybe you're looking at something like reasons for working from home. That's going to change pretty dramatically in the last 4 years alone versus if you're only looking at a data set from 2015. So you really have to take into account the passage of time and how that can be both a hindrance and it can be beneficial, because sometimes you want more time to pass in your research, and that gives you an opportunity to look at trends over time, which can be both a benefit but also a drawback of secondary data. So that is where we are going to wrap up our lecture on Chapter 8. Join me for the next lecture where we're going to continue talking about big data sets, and primarily we're going to be talking about big data. So I will see you all in the next lecture.